I must say, this is the only time I've worn a tie in public, and it's for Don. I want to just say very quickly just that I've had a number of births in my life, which is almost as long as Don's, not quite. And in anthropology, my birth in the subject was when I joined a small group of researchers in Central Africa who were then organised at the Rhodes Livingstone Institute, which had really been established as an anthropological centre by Max Gluckman. That was my first creation as an anthropologist, which... yeah, is it all right? Can you hear me? Yeah. My second birth was actually in Manchester itself when I encountered Don. And Don's approach, as David has mentioned, his intricate interest in detail and his concern with the logic of form was already present when I met him. He'd just come back from his work in Jerusalem on a covered workshop, and he was working intensely at that time on his book, which became his book Work and Play, which was in fact a kind of a critique of the very important work of Irving Goffman. And this is actually Don for me, not only the kind of thing that he's been talking about today, and for a long time he's been developing this line for a very long time, and very influential on me and many others. But I also want to point out what Don is to me, somebody who always disagreed with just about every single position that is developed, first of all in the social sciences, and he's sort of expanding his disagreement, and out of these disagreements always is born something exciting and new. And in many ways, Don epitomizes for me what anthropology is in a way, a kind of a form of theoretical physics. That is something which exists outside the accepted and is prepared to always take up something which has somehow been rendered minor or disregarded and not considered enough, and has investigated these things that have been excluded and discovered in them something really magnificent. And that's what Don continually does to me. So thank you very much, Don, for doing that. I had a lot more to say, but that's where I'll leave it before I begin, because I'm constrained by time. And I'm not very good at excerpting things. I have a very long paper that I wrote some time ago that I thought when I was asked to come here I would deal with that, because it was the only thing that really fitted in with what Don is now developing, and that it was in fact developed in relation to Don. And so everything that Don is saying, I'm sort of struggling a bit to sort of work it out in this paper, which I will come back to as a result of this meeting. And it's about my work, in fact, on sorcery, which was part of that book that David mentioned, the Feast of the Sorcerer. Now, that book was written very much in the phenomenological tradition of Edmund Husserl. And Edmund Husserl's argument about the nature of consciousness as related to subjective intentionality. It's our intentional direction into the world out of which consciousness is born. So it's born in the way in which we are directed into the realities that we live. In a sense, Alfred Schutz also develops on that with his notion of consciousness as a cone of light, that when we read a book, we cast our mind upon particular elements of that book and that work, and a cone of light, if you like, is shone upon it, our consciousness is expanded and something emerges out of that. So, in a sense, consciousness is something which comes from us, individual human beings, and we construct the world and the universes around it. Now, Don's work, as I see it now developing very clearly, is actually trying to transcend that kind of Husserlian, Schutzian social science limitation, the thing that is based in some kind of subjectivity and which is, in a sense, involves some kind of subjective-objective dualism, which is a kind of problem in philosophy and in social science and so on. And that there's something that doesn't sort of ring true on that. Now, let me just see if I can quickly make another point before I show you a quick illustration, which I'll try to talk to very, very briefly and inefficiently. I was very influenced by reading, as also Don has also worked this through as well, Gilles Deleuze's work on cinema. Now, cinema was for him a new form of aesthetic. It's for the first time in human being, there's a new aesthetic form epitomized by cinema, which is not reducible to things in the past. It opened up new ways of understanding human being more by accident than by design. And it was these new understandings that came out of the pragmatic demand of cinema to somehow recreate the nature of life and to reproduce our experience of life. And this is the nature of the cinematic and, in fact, an invention of modern technology, of all kinds of influences and so on. I won't go on about that. But he argues that cinema is actually a very modern creation and realizes a great advance over earlier forms of human creation. And in fact, through cinema, we begin to understand something more about human being than we would understand before. And so he looks at the nature of time and the development of two aspects of time, what he calls the movement image, which is very much related to a Bergsonian notion of durée and an attempt to deal with that. He criticizes Bergson, in fact. And then there's the time image itself, which he talks about as time in itself, out of which durée and various forms of processual time may be experienced. So he looks at two forms of time in cinema that are developed technologically, the movement image and what he calls the time image or crystalline time, where time comes out of itself. The idea of the close-up, for example, in cinema, is something which actually begins to look at the way in which something begins to emerge out of itself, which is a dimension I think that Don is also developing. Now, my general argument is that I could look at some of this ritual stuff that I've been looking at, not in Husserlian terms, but in Deleuzean terms. And I disagree with Deleuze. Deleuze actually says, look, cinema is a new invention. It overcomes what he talks about as ancient notions of time, which are located in ritual forms. But I would say no, that actually in ritual, in certain types of ritual, there was an immanent understanding of the very thing that Deleuze is trying to get at in his cinema books, that actually certain kinds of ritual, certainly ones I encountered, actually had predicted Deleuze, if I could put it that way, and that there was something going on in them that actually Deleuze's stuff about cinema actually made more sensible. They'd already discovered it in a way, that ritual is not this thing that is to be understood in terms of drama and all these sort of things that Victor Turner and very many other anthropologists have talked about. Actually, cinema is closer to the nature of ritual than anything else. And I try to explain that by using Deleuze. So that gives you the rough idea that there's something going on in ritual which is much closer to the nature of the way in which we experience cinema than anything else. Now, the simple point that I'm trying to make is that in cinema, as Deleuze himself argues, the screen, the cinema screen, is the brain. It's that in which across that screen and its different movements within that screen, the different possibilities of our consciousness is actually created. Consciousness comes to us rather than consciousness coming from us. It's a Husserlian position that says consciousness comes from us. It's a cinematic tradition that says consciousness comes to us. When we're in a cinema, good cinema I'm talking about, but even bad ones work this way, you can cry in a terrible film, you can really be moved by it. The point is that the actual film embraces us and reconstitutes us to its processes, okay? And in a sense, that's what ritual is too, okay? And there's many ways in which it works, which does that. Let me see if I can talk about this way, in which it's far more powerful than, for example, representational modes and dramatic modes and theatre modes. If we look at some of the anthropologists that have been very influential upon us all, like Victor Turner, for example, it's a theatrical metaphor that he operates with. But I think we'd get a much better understanding of ritual processes and consciousness and so forth if we considered this cinematic position that someone like Deleuze is developing, and that I think Don actually has gone beyond, well beyond, and pushing it in sort of a larger way. Let me see if I can give you, before I... You'll be totally unconvinced by what I have to say, but I recommend that you have a look at some of this. Let me just go back. I'm very bad with things. This is the area that I was working in Sri Lanka many long years ago. Thank you very much. Many long years ago, got wiped out by a tsunami. But this is a ritual called the Sunyama, which is a major anti-sorcery rite, and this is the major structure which is built as a centre of the ritual. It's a time machine, I suppose I could call it. And this is a patient in sorcery who is required to wear a special shawl, which is the shawl of the original victim of sorcery, who is, according to the myth, is raped. These are Buddhists. Is raped by the cousin of Mahasamanta, the world king, the first Buddha, in fact, as well. She is raped by the world poisoner, the sort of sorcerer par excellence at the beginning of time. And she has to dress in the shawl of Mahasamanta, the world king's wife, who's been raped by the sorcerer, the first victim of sorcery. And she must focus on that, on this building. And then the whole ritual goes on all night and all day for a full Sinhalese day, over 30 hours. And there's a particular sequence which is the line that the patient will pass at the very beginning of the thing. The patient moves from a position outside this ritual time machine that you saw, and must move along the path of the viper of sorcery and retrace, in a sense, the course of her or his sorcery affliction. Sorcery is, as Don and David have pointed out in their own work in India, is about blockage, about blocking the capacity to, in fact, act in the world. You're barred at every point. And so what you do in this rite is pass along the line of sorcery, a series of blockages which you have to cross and progressively erase. I just want to make a simple point. I have to get you to read more complex ethnography than I'm presenting now. But this line I interpreted initially as a line of intentionality. that the patient was placed outside the time machine, if you were, and was casting his or her gaze upon that structure that she's turned to. So it was a perfect example of Husserlian notions of consciousness and consciousness arising out of an individual intentional thing. Now, what I did was disregard actually my own ethnography. The actual ritualists that I was working with said, you know, I didn't understand Husserl. No one ever read Husserl. They wouldn't be interested in Husserl. They said, no, this is not about, you know, anything that you're talking about, Bruce. Actually, what's happening is that the patient is being drawn within this structure. By looking at it, the patient is being grasped by a consciousness, actually the Buddha in their terms, which is part of this machinery. The patient is being drawn in. The patient is not moving herself or himself into this structure. The patient is being drawn. That is, that ritual structure is an active force in itself. And at the centre of that active force is time, as you'll find out as you go along. So the patient, rather than drawing herself towards the thing, is being drawn by the ritual, by the force of the rite itself. The patient is actually carries one of their here. All the symbols along there it's about the alphabet of language. In the condition of sorcery, you lose language, you lose the capacity to act. But your language is re-embodied in you as you cross the various blockages and so forth. Language is born, and you go into the centre of the thing, which is the actual point of crystalline time in Deleuze's cinematic notion. If I can quickly go back, that process of moving into that ritual machine, time machine, is what Deleuze, using his cinematic material, would call the movement image. Okay, that these are various points of the retracing or development of the person and the incapacity of the person to act. So it's a kind of process of erasing everything that you are and which sorcery is, in order that you can be reborn. But it's a process which fits neatly with Deleuze's notion of the time image. Let me just quickly go over that. That what he does is he deals with Bergson's work and Bergson's view of time as durée. And now Bergson sees primitive notions of time, that is pre the modern age, as sort of static and without a notion of process. That time, if you look at dance and so forth, is built up through a series of poses, a whole lot of static images which together produce a notion of movement. And Deleuze disagrees with him about that in relationship to cinema and looks at, for example, cartoons, the very first moment of the creation of cinema. It's really cinema in its early comic moments, in its Buster Keaton moments, or its Harry Lloyd moments, and so on. It's in cartoons too. I remember doing this to Don a long time ago here in this very place, saying that Don reminded me a lot of Coyote in that wonderful cartoon. Always sort of having a new plan to work out something, and which the thing would destroy. I think Wile E. Coyote is just a brilliant cartoon creation, and it's Don in many ways. But what Deleuze argues is, if you look at a cartoon, the poses are not anything but moments within the completion of the whole. These are not static poses. These are slices through the development of the image in time. So it's always a dimension of the whole, not of the part. These are not static moments. These are a continuous moment of creation. And so that path of intentionality that I talk about is not a set of static things. It's both, in a sense. It's killing the stasis that is the condition of sorcery. At the same time, it's also creating the condition in which what is a static thing becomes a process, that you begin to achieve a wholeness that, in a sense, you've lost in the condition of sorcery. And this is what is happening as the patient moves into that structure. And in the center of that structure is where the patient enters what Deleuze would call, in his analysis of cinema, crystal time, time in itself. This is the close-up, if you like, where, in a sense, the human being no longer is moving, but is at a point of intensity, of high intensity, whereby, in a sense, the world is recreated out of the human being itself. It's a moment of absolute intensity. Just to make the point, Deleuze is, when he does his work on cinema, is making a distinction between cinema before the Second World War and cinema after the Second World War. Two moments of cinema which are very much affected by the events in Europe, and that the movement to these sorts of forms of production are somehow historically related. I'm taking that history aside and saying, look, what he's talking about in the development of cinema is already well developed in the structure of certain rituals that I know. Here is the cinematic before cinema. In a sense, the ritual already has intimated the kinds of philosophical points, anti-Husserlian points, anti-Kantian points, actually, that Deleuze is trying to work with. And it's Deleuze that brings in a lot of science and so forth, mathematics and so forth, in order to develop his thought. So what I'm trying to argue is that what Don is arguing is actually beautifully borne out, I think, in the structure of this very, very brilliant rite. I can fill out a little bit more if we go back somewhat. Yes, if you have a look at, that beautiful building, which is a mock-up of the city of Mahasamata and of the palace, the actual place where the patient is seated that you saw in the previous slide is actually understood by the ritualists as the bedroom of Mahasamata and his bride, the place that the demon world poisoner invades and destroys. So that's how it sort of fits with the myth. But if you were to look at that structure and look at it in depth, you'd see that it was made from different types of plants, different types of leaves, different types of medicinal things. Within it was the hierarchy of the cosmos, demons at the bottom, mini gods a bit above it. Finally, you've got the great gods at the top, but surmounted ultimately by the Buddha, or by the great ritualist, that is, human being in the Buddhist universe, is that which determines the gods, rather than gods determining the human being. The radical distinction from some Hindu visions, at least as the Buddhists understand it in Sri Lanka. But that building is full of life, full of energy, with different temporalities, which is drawing the patient within it. It's got a cinematic effect before the invention of cinema. And it's ritual as cinema, I'm trying to argue, that is a better understanding of the potency of ritual than many of the ways in which we've understood ritual through the notions of drama and theatre and so on. At the same time, I'm saying that there's a wonderful argument located in here, which I think the arguments that Don is pushing actually exemplifies, if I can put it that way. This is a fantastic invention of human being, if you like, which is an insight into something which may be more universal, which is why I asked the question of Don earlier on, that all human beings have insights of a various kind. It's the anthropological bit in me, have insights of various kinds into the nature of what it is to be a human being, and that nobody has rights over that kind of knowledge. And this is an anthropological position that I have. And that's where I'll try to finish it. The argument I have is a lot more complicated, very much influenced by Don, actually. So there's lots of little things. And for example, at the end of this I hadn't had the time to describe it to you. There's a magnificent sequence of comedy. And that comedy appears just at the point when the patient in the middle of that thing will begin to emerge as a new human being. If you like, I didn't tell you this. I mean, I didn't tell you this. It was a really rather critical point to the whole argument, is that when you're afflicted by sorcery, this is a problem in time itself. Your birth time, the astrological dimensions of your background are critical. Your point of birth determines to some extent the kinds of karmic accidents that you're going to encounter, which may produce the sort of experience of inaction, blockage and so forth, which is the condition of sorcery. So you have to be, in a sense, radically reborn in time. Time has to be, in a sense, erased in one sense, that is your life trajectory up to your point of sorcery. That has to be erased, and you have to be literally reborn in time and out of time. And this is what this ritual is really doing. But there's this comedy, which is very interesting. The comedy is something which, like all comedy, it creates a truth which it then explodes. The sort of speed of comedy is this movement from one truth and its realizations of absurdity, the generation of another truth, its destruction and so forth. In fact, comedy is all about emergence and about open-endedness in the sense it can go on and on and on and on. And it's at that point, actually at the end of the comedy, that the patient in that building will begin to emerge and begin to destroy the building that is the machine of time that's around it. In a sense, the patient is a kind of being, a new being that emerges out of a chrysalis of time, if I can put it that way. I wish I could do a better job, but this actual ritual I saw when I first went to Sri Lanka in 1970. I saw it, I didn't understand a thing about it. I then wrote a book about exorcism rituals, which I thought I understood, and I didn't touch the Sunyama. I then wrote a book on the Sunyama. I thought I understood it. Had a Husserlian position. I didn't understand it. I then thought a bit with Deleuze, and I think I, at the moment, understand it a bit better, but obviously there's a lot more to be done. But it was very transforming for me, and listening to Don and thinking through Don. Don is a real source of my own thought continually. I thought I'd give this as a kind of offering to him again, because I think it can be, it really supports so much of what he says. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.